All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Kenneth Aguirre, and I'll be chairing our NVTC WMATA committee meeting tonight for September 17th. I'd like to note that we are starting at 6:05 p.m. Given the ongoing COVID-19 public health emergency, we are conducting this meeting electronically. We are able to do so because Governor Northam signed into law on April 22nd a legislative amendment to the budget bill to allow public bodies to meet electronically without a physical quorum present to discuss or transact the business statutorily required or necessary to continue operations of that public body. NVTC staff follow the procedures and guidelines in the legislative amendment to give notice to the committee, commission, staff, and the public. Commissioners and staff have called in using an audio teleconferencing platform while the meeting is simultaneously being broadcast to the public on YouTube. The only visual component of this meeting is the presentation slides, which are being shown to those on WebEx and on the YouTube stream. I also want to acknowledge that NVTC Chair Katie Crystal will be joining us later this evening to discuss the 3% cap working group. In order to help the meeting run as smoothly as possible under this format, I would like to lay out some procedures for everyone. I would ask that working group members hold their questions and or comments until the end of each presentation because of the size of the group. We'll be able to manage. Also, for members to direct their questions to staff to make sure that you identify yourself, so name and jurisdiction or representing which group you're representing, just to help with the facilitation and flow of the meeting. Please remember to stay on mute if you're not speaking. This will just help cut down on background noise. And if you've called in with a phone, sometimes you have to do *6 to unmute. And then if you're muting on your phone, also remember to unmute that part of your phone. Okay, I'm going to kick it over to Andrew DeVetter, NVTC's WMATA Program Manager, to call the roll to identify commissioners and NVTC staff present on this call.
Thank you, Chairman Aguirre. Please respond here when you hear your name. Chairman Aguirre.
Here.
Mr. Alcorn.
I'm here.
Mr. DiFerenti.
Here.
Mr. Letourneau.
Here.
Did Mr. Meyer join? Mr. Smedberg.
Present.
Mr. Snyder.
Here.
As a reminder, our bylaws state that committee meetings are open for any commissioner to attend. So I see Mike Turner.
Here.
And do I have any other commissioners that I missed? I don't think so. All right, well, we have a quorum. I'll now identify staff and include their titles for the benefit of the listening public. And I'll just list and no need to announce here. We have Executive Director Kate Mattice, Director of Policy and Programs Alan Fy. I am WMATA Program Manager Andrew DeVetter. We have Program Analyst Zach Smith and Greg Potts, Government Relations Officer from WMATA, is also joining us. At this point, I will turn it back over to the chair.
Thanks, Andrew. So according to the legislation signed by Governor Northam in response to the COVID-19 public health emergency, a public body or governing board convening a meeting during the declared emergency shall provide the public an opportunity to comment. In advance of this meeting, NVTC staff solicited written comments. Staff also captured public comments via Google Forms on NVTC's website. Any comments received by 3 p.m. today were provided to commissioners ahead of the meeting. Mr. DeVetter, did we receive any other additional comments?
We did not receive any comments.
Thank you. All right, I'd also like to acknowledge the rest of the NVTC staff who are working behind the scenes to make this meeting a success. Without you in this virtual world, we would be totally lost. So I'd like to turn to the first item on our agenda, the July 16th NVTC WMATA Committee meeting summary. I hope that everybody got a chance to look it over. And if you haven't, if you take a quick second, and if there's any questions or comments, please feel free. Oh, and I believe Mr. Meyer has joined us as well.
I'll move approval. Do we need to formally approve?
No. So I was just going to ask one more time. If there's no comments from committee members, then we'll go ahead and move to our second agenda item. Oh, and just as a quick note, since Ms. Crystal is going to be joining us a little bit later on, we're just switching the agenda item for the WMATA budget update. So we're going to go ahead and start with that first. Are there any objections to the reordering of the agenda? Hearing none, thank you all. We're going to take a look at this. For the benefit of the viewing public, we will begin with the update on WMATA's fiscal year 2021 and fiscal year 2022 budgets. For this agenda item, I wanted to invite our Virginia members of the WMATA board to discuss the changes to the FY 2021 budget and what lies ahead for fiscal year 2022. So I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Smedberg and Mr. Letourneau. Mr. Smedberg, are you starting this off?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start it off, Matt, and I'll turn it over to you for a couple slides as well. Does that sound good?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. As you know, and you yourself are dealing with in your jurisdictions, WMATA is dealing with a drop in ridership, and in turn, has seen a drop in revenue because of that. We have been able to manage thus far due to the CARES Act money that it came into the authority, and some good moves on behalf of our financial staff. But that money is projected to run out in the December, January timeframe for us, and so we are looking at some difficult financial decisions coming up to adjust the budget, not only for fiscal year 21, but looking ahead to fiscal year 22, which we'll touch upon briefly later. Right now, we are not anticipating any additional financial relief with this proposal. I'm sure have been following this in the news and on your various feeds. Transit is not included in any of the packages that we've heard about thus far. So we are anticipating we will get no additional federal relief in the next package for transit. It's not that we're not continuing to try, and our general manager and other folks have been very active, Greg and Regina and others, making sure that they are promoting that. Our congressional delegation has been very supportive of us in the past, and are continuing to be supportive of transit in general. So that's important to know. We anticipate a budget gap in this the remainder of this fiscal year to be in the range of $212 million by the end of our fiscal year. And for those listening, that is in the end of June of 21. So we are looking at these changes, to balance the budget. We're required to do that by the compact. Zach, can we have the next slide, please? So to close that gap, there was a proposal on the table, and it was thoroughly discussed by the WMATA Board Finance Committee at its last meeting. And the board, I should give some background on this, have been listening and learning for about the last month or so now as to, the extent to which, that we were going to have to make some, adjustments, and taking in a whole host of information points and data points from management. So what the Finance Committee discussed and finally agreed upon, and what the board is going to discuss tomorrow morning, is what we'll talk about here tonight. And closing this gap is going to be a combination of board actions and some management actions that the general manager, Paul Wiedefeld, will take on his own. So in regard to the proposed board actions, there will be a deferral of some capital projects. The capital projects, though, will not impact any state of good repair or safety initiatives that are currently or scheduled to be underway. The reason for that is First, we simply don't want to go back in time and put WMATA in the position it was not too long ago. It's easy for groups and jurisdictions to go to the capital budget without having to make the tough choices on the operating side. But the board and management, and I know our funding partners, at least at the state levels and the district level, simply don't want us to go back and put the authority in any kind of position where we're having to do catch up, or we're putting the safety of not only our riders but our employees at risk. So we want to continue those efforts, and we've made some great strides. One of which is obviously the refurbishment of the various stations. There will be some Metrorail adjustments and service cuts, and the same on the bus, and there'll be some adjustments there to various bus routes, and potentially some cuts. Zach, the next slide. Matt, do you want to take the next couple? And I'll end up or finish up.
Sorry, my glitchy mute button. Yeah, I can. Let me, well, let's see. Let me just talk for a second though on the Silver Line issue before we go further, because I do want to kind of push back a little bit on the narrative that this is a delay entirely driven by the budget. That's kind of been the news headlines. And, the reality is we always were going to be in a very, literally a period of a few months between the very end of this fiscal year and the next fiscal year in terms of when the construction project would be A, complete, B, turned over to Metro, and then C, Metro had done appropriate testing and be able to start operations. So, we ended up shifting this a couple months, essentially, from more of an April, May timeframe to probably a July timeframe. And that's really based on a lot of what's happening with the project and what we think, the timeline will be for WMATA to be able to actually run the service. So there is a corresponding budget move with that to push those startup costs back a little bit. There still will be startup costs during this fiscal year because you can't just snap your fingers on July 1st and decide you're going to run phase 2. You have to hire people, and some of that's been going on already. This would result in WMATA slowing that down some, but just so we kind of understand that. I mean, I don't. It's not like it's going to be an indefinite delay due to budget reasons. It's really more just right sizing this, or kind of correcting the timeline for what the facts are on the ground. So in terms of the Metrorail adjustments, as you can see there, what we're looking at is essentially weekday rail frequency at 12 minutes on each lines. There's a proposal to reinstitute turnbacks on the red and yellow lines, and that's something that Maryland has concerns about, that I think Paul and I think is an appropriate, likely an appropriate measure based on the ridership. And all those turnbacks would do was effectively have 12-minute headway for the outer stations on the red and yellow lines, similar to the rest of the system. So it's not as if the level of service there would be any worse. Closing at 9 o'clock Sunday through Thursday, retaining the later 11 p.m. on Friday and Saturday. And then, as I said, the Silver Line Phase 2 on July 1, 2021. Do you want to go to the next one?
Matt, before we go to the next one,
yep.
Just a general, Zach, do you mind going? Yeah, just for the public and everything, do you mind just explaining what a turnback is exactly?
Yeah, turnback is just when the train is not completing the entire line. So it is completing a certain number of stations and then turning back. In this case, Grosvenor is one of them. I don't remember what the one is on the other side, but so there'd be 4 or so stations that wouldn't receive the same frequency of trains.
And Matt, this is Mike. Did I understand you correctly that even with the turnbacks on the red and yellow lines, that they'll still have 12-minute service on the outer stations?
That is correct.
Okay, thanks.
Because those lines receive at least the red line receives more frequent service even under this plan. You'll see it actually on the next slide.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
And Matt, just so everyone knows, you know this, I've been talking to the Maryland folks and about this, and you know, I think we'll be okay. So.
Good. Let me go to the next slide though, because that helps kind of tell the story. You know, and I made the comment at our board meeting that as difficult as these layoffs will be, 1,700 WMATA employees are potentially looking at layoffs, and that is a very painful thing for the organization. And as difficult it is to have to make cuts, when you look at this chart, I think this is still a very reasonable level of service. You know, 12-minute headways on the red line between Shady Grove and White Flint, that's the turnback in Glenmont and Forest Glen. There are other red line stations get 6-minute headways, weekdays, 12 minutes on the weekends. And then on the weekends, 15 minutes in Silver. Some of those inner combined services get less, and then 12 and 15 on yellow and 12 and 15 on green. And so that's still, I think, considering what ridership is right now, that's still a pretty reasonable level. Any questions about that, though?
Yeah, this is Dave Snyder. As a rider, I will say personally, I think these are reasonable headways. You get up to 18 and 20 minutes the way we were, and that begins to, I think, really discourage people. Do these 12-minute headways give you what you need financially? And do you foresee any construction projects that would dramatically increase those headways over the next, for the remainder of this fiscal year?
So in terms of financially, combined with the rest of this on bus, which we'll get to in a second, this gets us to the Fy21 problem, which is a $212 million problem. It would not get us to the larger potential 22 problem, which is about a 460 problem. And that number is after you've already included things like this, which are being done in 21. It's rolling over a lot of the 21 reductions, such as this. The Silver Line costs end up not being rolled over the savings because because the Silver Line will become operational in phase 2. But otherwise, that's kind of continuing everything. So that becomes a much different conversation. And obviously, we're going to take that to some extent and see what happens over a longer period of time here with federal legislation. But that's going to involve a different conversation on both rail and the bus side. In terms of the capital projects, I know, the Silver Line will have some additional shutdowns on the weekends, as we did complete most of the tie-in work, but now there's going to be the automatic train control testing that takes place. The physical tie-in was happened over the summer, but once you actually have trains there, you've got to do testing on the automatic train control systems and so on, or the computer software essentially. So that will happen. I don't know, Paul, if there's anything else out there.
Yeah, there's the testing. And then, they'll be making sure that the remedies that were addressed, in the agreement and everything, that they too are continuing to meet, the minimum standards. So, yeah, there'll be a bunch of testing going on. And then getting the yard up and running.
Matt, it's Walter. Just to follow up on that last question. So, these service cuts should get us through FY21, right?
Yes.
Okay, because I did read somewhere that there was still somewhat of a gap to close in 21, or did I just misread that?
So there were about $42 million of management actions. And then on top of that, the board now is moving forward and putting on the docket tomorrow at our meeting these actions on the rail side and then some others on the bus side, which we'll get to. But in total, what we're putting on the docket is actually a bigger number than the number we need to solve for. So there may be some opportunity, depending on public input and feedback we get from jurisdictions, to adjust some things. I think that probably would apply more on the bus side to specific route cuts. but we'll certainly see.
Okay, thank you. Certainly, I agree too that the cuts on rail, I think, are appropriate. This is, given where we are and probably all the way through FY21, I think that's going to be just fine.
Yeah.
This is Snyder. Two additional quick comments. First of all, I was on the East Falls Church, the renovated East Falls Church station, so applause to everyone involved. The station is dramatically better than it was, and I assume the others as well, number one. Number two, I think the ridership we all know is way down, and it reemphasizes the need to get the true story out there, that Metro and transit is actually very safe, in some ways safer than a lot of other places to be, but it continues to be circulating. The transit is not a good place to be under the pandemic. But this just reemphasizes that point again. So thanks.
Yeah, and this is Mike Turner. I've seen several articles internationally that emphasize the fact that there is no empirical, scientific, or medical data anywhere in the world that I know about that links and correlates with any degree of scientific basis COVID outbreaks and riding on transit. It just is not scientifically based. So I think a pretty aggressive marketing plan to highlight those points to the community might really help, because there's just no basis for it. And I think even though people are nervous about it, I think this is a great opportunity to educate the public to get them back on transit.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think we're going to be seeing that not only from WMATA, but the two states in the district as well. They do not want people getting back in their cars once they do start going back to the office.
And just one other point, I think they need to hear from their employers as well, because employees tend to listen first and foremost to the people that are writing their paychecks. So
yeah, well, that's a really good point, David. And the people are going to be, I think, hearing that from their employers. And I know there's a lot of coordination going on right now.
Right.
In that area.
Thanks.
Yeah, there is still ad marketing budget money available for this fiscal year, and that money is going to be dedicated toward that, transit is back and transit safe message that you both have mentioned.
I think this outreach program should continue to emphasize that passengers are required to observe all of the appropriate safety precautions, and that those that do not will be addressed on an individual basis. But so I think that this goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Yeah.
Do you want to just finish the presentation and go to the next slide?
Yeah, I think this is, go ahead, Matt.
The
last slide. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, this is just covering the bus side. So we're going to maintain the August service plan in place now, and that's roughly 88 to 90% of the normal service. And then also, we won't be, adding back some of those routes that were suspended as part of this service plan. There's been a lot of discussion about the collection of fares on Metrobus. I can tell you that many other transit systems have resumed collecting fares on buses and front loading. Metro is putting forward a proposal to do that on January 1st, 2020. This is a revenue generator. It's not huge numbers, but it does generate some revenue. I think I would have supported an earlier date, but the will of the board was not thus. So January 1 is what's being put forward. I don't know, Paul, if there's anything you want to add on that.
You and I are of like mind in that area, and I think Q2 would have been fine, but Q3 seemed to be the best compromise at this point, and who knows, it could change. So right now Q3 seems to be the best compromise.
And it is worth noting that there are plexiglass panels installed for the protection of the operators now on Metrobus. And that's one of the reasons why, from a health and safety perspective, management was comfortable resuming collecting fares whenever it was the will of the board to do so. So in terms of timeline, as you can see there, tomorrow we will meet. That meeting was pushed back as was discussed, but we will put these items on the public docket. There'll be a public hearing process, and then later in the fall, we'll approve these budget changes with implementation in January and customer notification in December. And there's one more slide. About FY22.
Yeah. So just, some background for folks again, the pandemic is anticipated to continue to impact WMATA revenue and expenses, for the foreseeable future, well into next year, calendar year and fiscal year. The potential gap, as Matt mentioned earlier, for 22 that we are already planning on and we're working with the general manager on is upwards of $450, $460 million in that range. And that, again, is in addition to what we're adjusting for in 21. So combined, that's a pretty big figure. And again, just to remind folks, the actions that we'll take tomorrow to bring to public comment and potentially ultimately approve in early November will address the funding gap for the fiscal year of 21, again, in the $212 million range. And then the general manager, I know he and his team are already working on the 22 budget, and that too will be introduced in November.
Hey, Paul, could I so we're going to be going from a $2 billion budget last year to what, like a $1.4 billion budget in 2 years? Is that right?
Well, having to adjust for that, if you look at it that way, yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and that's when
it's sizable
reduction. Coming from very minimal fare collection on rail, for a rail system, traditionally have had a pretty good fare recovery rate. A lot of that is just being driven by that revenue reduction. So, there's variables there. Obviously, people could resume riding sooner than we're anticipating. We did have quite a bit of discussion on the board about what scenarios to plan for in terms of ridership. And we did take probably the most conservative approach because it's always easier to sort of add back service and solve for a smaller problem to have to solve for a larger problem than anticipated. And so, it could be that the gap is not as large because ridership comes back sooner, or there's greater revenue coming. But under I think not ridiculous, under a reasonable but conservative model, that budget gap grows to $464 million. And of course, that's also assuming there's no federal money coming. And so we're talking, $9 no matter what happens in November, there's different dynamics at play. So it's certainly possible things change a little bit.
And Walter, the financial folks at the authority, did make some good financial moves early on in this crisis and helped a lot, to get us through, the remainder of the year, early next year. But, after that, sort of all bets are off, so to speak.
Okay, thanks.
And I think another factor, maybe two things to say, wrap this a little. Number one, we need to make sure that we're continuing to have a good dialogue with all of you and the Commonwealth about funding. Obviously, if all of this is assuming that all the subsidy payments are made as planned and scheduled and budgeted. If they're not, if they're reduced, then that creates a bigger gap that has to be solved for. So I think, right now we have a pretty good handle on the local budgets. There was a reduction, $135 million rebate provided to the jurisdictions from WMATA early in the pandemic that hopefully helped provide some relief for jurisdictions for this fiscal year. I think it's a little bit more on the state side as they work through some of these issues. And then the other thing is, as it moves into the public docket, certainly, if there are specific routes, specific bus routes in particular that need to be flagged, that maybe, staff has missed something in analysis or whatever, make sure that those come up to us and go through the great NVTC staff here so that we can work with WMATA staff to try to fix what we can.
And Walter and others, we're also very mindful of the fact that, I think the way the real estate taxes and other things came in for you all for the remainder of 21, you fared, okay. But we're also very mindful that on the local and state level, fiscal year 22 is going to be, potentially very challenging for you all. So, that's also very top of mind for us.
Thank you. Good.
I just had a question. This is Matt. I wanted just to check. You mentioned, Paul, earlier that none of the proposals on the House in the federal stuff, I think the approach of you have to advertise legally and understanding that we're in a long haul, difficult fiscal situation makes sense. But I would imagine that if there were federal relief, it wouldn't come until after the new year. I guess I'm curious if anyone knows if any of the proposals on either side there is some transit in the House side, isn't there? There's not? Okay.
No.
We're really hearing that.
I mean, not only is there not money for transit, there's no money for aviation either. And I know they're really worried about the aviation industry, but there's no money for aviation or transit thus far. Again, thus far. Now, I know some of the Democratic leaders are pushing, but there's and Greg, you can chime in here, Greg Potts. I think some of the feedback we're hearing, and not from our delegation, but maybe from others, is that, transit, you got your help. There are other more immediate, concerns and needs, and, you already got your help.
Yeah, I was just going to add from what I've heard and from what we've heard, this is actually fairly bipartisan in terms of not to provide relief. And I think if you just look at a map and you think about, who's really impacted right now in terms of major transit systems, there's not that many. There's, we're the second or third largest in the country. Obviously, New York is heavily impacted, Boston is impacted, Chicago, but it's just sort of the cities that have these large transit systems that are really, really impacted with major ridership fall downs, because a lot of the cities are seeing much higher rates of people working from home and so on. So I think the attitude, sort of, unless you kind of represent one of those directly, there's not a lot of desire because of other needs. So hopefully, that will change. Hopefully there'll be some, kind of breakthrough on that, but.
Got it. Speculation is the state and local that we've heard about in this next level would be, is there a thought that would be used to help with the smaller number of systems? I haven't thought about it as thoroughly as you or Greg probably have.
Say the first part of that again.
The first part? Yeah.
The state and local, I thought in this second package there was some more direct state and local funding for governments.
Oh,
I don't know whether there's anything.
Second round of CARES Act, you mean?
Yes.
Well, so there was some transit operating assistance provided to the Commonwealth, which was then provided in a convoluted way through Metro for some of the local systems. But each state kind of dealt that differently. I don't know if any staff have a better handle on that.
Yeah, I think it's in the weeds too much, but I was thinking about the next round. It's because concerning that, and I can see why it makes sense, but concerning that there's bipartisan consensus that there wouldn't be additional funding. So thank you for at least helping me think.
Yeah, and I don't want to. I mean, who knows? We're just as of now, that's kind of what we're hearing.
And Matt, that's what Matt said earlier is why we're taking a very sort of conservative approach to things, which I personally think, and other board members obviously think, that is the wise thing to do here. So that's why we took that approach overall, because of some of the factors.
Helpful and seems smart to me too.
Yeah.
Staff, did you have any input from that last question at all?
This is Greg. I mean, on the federal side, the only thing that I'll add is that at the House, they're a little more supportive of transit. It's really been on the Senate side where there hasn't been anything at all for transit. So that's been sort of the discussion moving forward on the Senate side.
The other factor I should mention is, so with the first round of money, there was a requirement essentially, or an expectation that there would be no layoffs if you accepted that money. And so if we're thinking about any future that comes, in order for that particular string to be attached, it would have to be a very sizable amount of money, or the strings couldn't be as strict in terms of that issue, because if there's still a reduction in revenue and the amount coming from the federal government isn't going to make up that gap, then all the transit systems are still going to need some flexibility with some service reductions and potential layoffs and those sorts of things. So one concern that I have looking at federal legislation is if we get some money, but it can strings on it that, essentially make it so that you can't lay anybody off, then it's going to be difficult to take that money because it won't solve the problem. So something to think about as all this kind of plays out.
Well, and I would just add, if we really look at reductions of the scale we're talking about for 22, that's really going to be, there are going to be some really hard discussions that would have to happen. That I can't imagine, well, anyway, all I was going to say is that could affect a cross section of issues, not just service delivery, but including probably the whole subsidy structure, because I can't imagine how those cuts could be made without so affecting service in some ways that a lot of things would have to be reviewed. Hopefully, we would never have to get there. Thank you.
So I have another question. So we're saying that there's a 12 million shortfall, but that we're looking to cut more than that potentially tomorrow. How much are we talking about potentially cutting overall tomorrow?
So it's a $212 million shortfall. And what we're doing tomorrow is just placing items on the docket. So it's kind of like your local government tax process. You usually advertise a higher rate than you really adopt because you can't go over the rate that you advertise. So what WMATA is doing, what we'll do tomorrow, is there's about $20 million of potential reductions beyond that number that we need to solve for, which will give the board a little bit of flexibility to potentially increase some levels of service or reduce some layoffs within that 20 million. But exactly what that will be will depend on what input we get and what the board ends up deciding. So, but there's just a little bit of buffer that will go out for public advertisement. So tomorrow's vote is really about putting things on the docket so that it's eligible for the reduction. But that actual vote won't happen in terms of what the cut will be until later in the fall.
Do we have more discussion from any of the commissioners?
Mechanic, it won't be too far from that 212. Sorry,
okay. That's good to hear. Yeah.
Yeah, 212 is the number. We're putting more on the docket than 212 tomorrow.
Yeah, because part of me just kind of feels, if there's in 212, if you were to do another, 10 on top of that, considering what we're going to be facing going into fiscal year 22, I mean, might as well just keep it to the 212, and we're going to be in a huge jam either way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not going to get easy, that's for sure.
No, yeah, definitely. So thank you, Paul and Matt. Staff, NVTC staff, any additional remarks you want to make? Going once, going twice. All right.
And Mr. Chairman, I need to drop off. I may be able to rejoin, but I need to drop off right now. So if anybody has more questions about any of that, you know where to find me.
No problem. Thanks, Matt. Okay. So tune in tomorrow morning if you want to get the details firsthand. I believe it's Mr. Smedberg, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's at 8:30. Is that right?
8:30. Yes, starting at 8:30 tomorrow.
All right. If there's no more comments on this item, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next agenda item, because we are now joined by NVTC Chair, and you chairing the 3% cap working group too, Ms. Katie Crystal. So included in the 2018 transit funding legislation in Virginia, WMATA is subject to a 3% cap on the annual growth in the operating subsidies that are paid by the compact jurisdictions, including NVTC jurisdictions. The General Assembly directed the NVTC chair to convene a working group to review the impact of the 3% cap. This committee provided guidance to the working group at the July meeting to make no legislative changes to the cap at this time. The working group has completed their initial findings on the cap, and members of the WMATA committee received a draft of the final report in the meeting materials materials at the last meeting. So tonight we will conclude our discussion of the working group's report on the 3% cap to the General Assembly. Before I turn it over to staff, I'd like to ask Chair Crystal if she'd like to make any remarks. Chair Crystal.
Thank you very much, Chair Aguirre. Can you guys hear me? Ken, we're good? Okay, great. Thank you. So as was just noted, we've just completed as the working group the report to the General Assembly on the 3% cap. The goal tonight is to discuss any comments that this committee might have about the cap before it's sent to the full commission. As a reminder, the legislation that required us to do this tasked us to have this report into the chairs of the money committee, the money committees, which is House Appropriations, Senate's Finance and Appropriations, by November 10. So we are aiming for the October meeting of the commission to get approval. Staff is going to present, and Zach has done an absolutely extraordinary job of facilitating the group, pulling together the data that really informed our discussions that you all saw last time the WMATA committee convened. And so he's going to talk a little more about some of the key findings. And he's also going to talk about a companion report to the commission. So to preview the big headline, the committee is recommending, the working group is recommending no changes to the legislature. We are all pretty cognizant, as I think many members of this commission are, that an idea or sort of sharing a thought for the future can quickly become legislation. And so we really wanted to be clear that at this time, we think that more time is needed to see how that 3% cap and the exclusions are playing out. But we did have some good conversations, facilitated again by Zach's excellent research, and we wanted to put a marker down that these are some of the things that we think the commission should track and keep in mind and continue to evaluate with regard to the 3% cap over time. And then, if it makes sense for the commission in future years to present legislative recommendations to the General Assembly, we entrust the commission to do so. So some of those things that might be, or that will show up in that report, again, to the commission, not the legislature, are more details and analysis on the cap, issues like WMATA's implementation of the cap, some sort of things about next steps that, again, we think are better suited to the commission rather than accidentally becoming Code of Virginia. So staff is going to work with the WMATA committee, this group, and the commission on overall timing of the companion report. Tentatively, they're working towards having that finished in early 2021 in their work plan. So that is a lot of context, and I hope I've teed up now Zach Smith to talk substantively about some of the things that are going to be in that report to the General Assembly and in the companion report to the Commission.
All right. Well, thank you, Chair Crystal. So I am happy to present the findings on the 3% cap in the report to the General Assembly. This is a big turning point for the working group just to get this report completed. And so, as Chair Crystal said, why did we do this report? The General Assembly charged the Chair of NVTC to examine two things, both the usefulness of the cap and whether any additional items should be excluded. And so in writing this report, the working group used those two items and those two questions, rather, to define the scope of the report to the General Assembly. But of course, since the working group reviewed a lot of other information on the cap and received a lot of data and feedback, we went a little bit beyond what the General Assembly's directive was, and we will put those, and as Katie Crystal said, the companion report to the Commission at a later date. And so this slide is just a recap of who are our working group members. We have our chair, Katie Crystal, our vice chair, Kate Mattice. We had participation from Jennifer Mitchell from DRPT, as well as those senior level transportation officials from NVTC, WMATA jurisdictions, and our private sector stakeholders. And so the next set of slides essentially just mirror what's in the report to the General Assembly. And so, again, based on feedback from this committee, the working group found the cap useful. And because it has only been in place for 2 budget cycles, the working group recommends no legislative changes at this time. And so the beginning of the report looks at the operating subsidy payments to WMATA before a cap was in place and what drove those increases in the historical operating subsidies. And so we just wanted to tell a story behind those subsidies and include that in the report. And so as background, the historical operating subsidies were calculated using formulas based on Metrobus, Metrorail, and Metro Access. And what's key with this slide is that what we found is that the changes in the Metrorail operating subsidy, whether it be service increases, fare box recovery rates, and ridership declines, they all had a large impact on the total amount Virginia was paying in its operating subsidies from fiscal years 2011 to 2018. And also, once the cap was applied in the FY 2020 budget, we acknowledge that there are some unintended consequences to WMATA's implementation of the cap. And here's one of those points in the report where we acknowledge those unintended consequences, but seeing as our audience is the General Assembly, we wanted to keep the level of detail included in this report appropriate for that audience. And we also reviewed the annualized wage increases in the previous collective bargaining agreements that WMATA negotiated with its largest union, ATU Local 689, and found that the cap was helpful during labor negotiations when it was in place. And so this is just a visual of the historical operating subsidies from FY11 to FY19. I think the key takeaway here is that there were significant fluctuations in the cap. And as I stated earlier, Metrorail was a huge driver behind these changes. For instance, if you look from FY13 to FY15, there are those significant increases, and that's due to the startup costs and revenue service for Silver Line Phase 1. Also in FY17, it was the general manager's first year, and so there were no major jurisdictional subsidy increases. Everything was sort of frozen in time from the previous year, and so you can see that illustrated with the small change from FY16 to FY17 and why that's so low. And then just moving ahead in FY18, we begin to see the effects of Safe Track and the steep ridership declines, which means that the fare box recovery lowered on Metrorail and the jurisdictional subsidy subsequently increased. So now I'm just going to go through the findings of the report. And this slide is just a visual of what has happened to the operating subsidy since the cap was applied, or since it's been in place, rather. It's important to note that it's only been applied twice for the fiscal year 2020 budget and the fiscal year 2021 budget. The report mentions and reminds the General Assembly that the cap is new. There are some things that need to be worked out, and the recommendations are based on the fact that the cap has only been in place, as I said, for 2 budget cycles. So here on the left, in FY20, the 3% cap is applied to the individual operating subsidies for Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. Then you have the legislative exclusions applied for those federal mandates and legal disputes, which are exclusions to the cap. And then we have our percent change in the FY20 operating subsidy, so around 4% for everyone in the region. And then on the right, we have the FY21 subsidy, and this is without the CARES Act funding. And so again, WMATA applies a 3% to the individual operating subsidy for each of the compact members. And then legislative exclusions were applied for federal mandates. And then we also have the exclusions applied for the Silver Line Phase 2 operating costs. And so that was a significant driver in the increases to the FY21 subsidy. And so, like I said, just our findings from the working group, the cap appears to be useful in managing the growth in the operating subsidy. Because it's only been used in 2 budget cycles, the working group recommends that there are no legislative changes at this time. And also the working group recommends that no changes be considered to legislation before the cap is in place for at least 5 WMATA budget development cycles. And for additional stakeholders, we wanted to make sure the General Assembly knows that we did our due diligence in talking to the other WMATA compact members and WMATA about the cap. And just so that this committee is aware, overall, our regional partners in Maryland and DC, they do support a tool to manage the growth in operating subsidies. They also had some similar concerns on those unintended consequences that came with the cap's application. And in our conversations, we also discussed whether a cap would be on a signatory like it is now, or whether it would be a regional cap as well. And then for our additional legislative exclusions, and this is a list of the current legislative exclusions that we have to the cap, sort of any service, equipment, or facility that is required by law, so those federal mandates, any major capital projects approved by the WMATA board before or after the effective date of the CTB policy, any payment or obligations resulting from a legal dispute or proceeding involving WMATA, and our newest exclusion, any service increases approved by the WMATA board. And so that last exclusion has not yet been applied, so we haven't seen sort of the implications of that yet. But at this time, the working group recommends no additional exclusion to the cap. And this is just a recap of the recommendations to the General Assembly. So again, we're recommending no changes be made to the existing cap legislation, no additional exclusions, no changes be considered before the cap has been in place for 5 budget development cycles, and that NVTC continue to evaluate the impact of Virginia's 3% cap legislation. And so with that, I will turn it back over to the chair for any comments, questions, and discussion about the report. Mr. Chair.
Kennick, I think you might be on mute.
Technology.
In case that's not true, and it happens to the best of us, I told you were on mute while I was on mute, so.
That's even better. So again, thank you, Zach. Chair Crystal, any closing remarks on this at all?
No, I don't think so. Again, I think Zach really did a terrific job summarizing the work. I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have, particularly about that kind of dual nature report, one to the General Assembly and one back to the Commission.
All right. Commissioners, any questions?
No, I just say nice job, Katie, Zach, team. That's very well done.
Thank you, Mr. Elkhorn. And I actually should share credit that each of your jurisdictional staff participated and were really terrific, giving thoughtful insights and kind of on-the-ground experiences with the way the cap's been applied. So thank you to Mr. Bashadny in your case.
I had one question. First, it's great to see the two chairs at one time, and you guys try to figure out
the unmute button.
Which one of you is the right chair to be asking. The context that you provided at the beginning was, I had a couple of questions, but it kind of became clear that not making any news was sort of the purpose of the way that some of it was laid out. And it's succinct, it's good, it's solid. I guess the question is there an underlying assumption that we would come back closer to 3% or 4% or 5% if, but for the Silver Line Phase 2 opening, and that we're decently confident that it will come down closer and the 3% will have more impact. Is that fair?
I think that's right. I'm going to invite Zach and potentially Kate to join in too. But I think certainly that's the case, right? We have a major expansion of service in fiscal 21, we think, right? Subject to the catastrophe that we're all in. But I think, certainly we would expect, right, to not be at that 12% growth year over year under more normal circumstances. It does invite, though, a comment that we certainly talked with the working group when we last assembled that this has to come with a giant asterisk, obviously, for everything this committee was just discussing. This is a nearly existential time for the system. And so, this is, hopefully we will return to life as we once knew it and be having these sort of more regular conversations. But, my expectation would be that without major service expansions, we wouldn't see a real growth of 12% consistently. Kate, Zach, would you agree, disagree? What do you think?
I would agree with that. I think one key thing to note with our sort of exploration of the cap is, again, it's only been applied twice. And so those fluctuations will happen from year to year. And it's not, I don't know if we'll have another Silver Line Phase 2 that'll drive those subsidy increases anytime soon. But with a legislative exclusion that sort of allows for any service increase approved by the WMATA board, that's still, we're still waiting to see what that would do to the subsidies.
Great, thanks. Well, that helps. I mean, the only, I guess part of the benefit on page 7, I knew about the Silver Line startup costs, but I wonder for those who are not as imbued as pretty much everyone who will be reading this, if, sort of referring to it as starting costs in that piece of it that's the only thought that is a suggestion that Zach, you and Kate and the chairs will know more about. But that last sentence before the footnotes, that's the modifier that for the uninitiated might be helpful.
Right.
I think that's an excellent suggestion, considering too, we don't know how broad of a lay audience it might find beyond the General Assembly, but for the uninitiated, as you said, I think that's a good suggestion.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments from the commissioners? All right, well, I'd just like to thank Ms. Katie Crystal one more time, and Zach and the rest of the staff that's been working on this. I think we've got something good to bring forward to the whole commission. So now we're going to go ahead and move to agenda item number 5. Are there any other items to bring before the committee?
Mr. Chair, just one quick thing before we move on. I just wanted to briefly talk about what's going to come in that companion report to NVTC on the 3% cap. So again, it'll be that in-depth data analysis about the historical operating subsidies. We wanted to make sure that the commission was fully aware of the working group's discussions about the cap, as well as what we heard from our counterparts in Maryland and DC. And we did have a conversation with WMATA about the cap as well. And of course, their sentiments will be included in that report. And we'll also include some possible alternatives or modifications to the cap, but just noting that not every signatory has the same exact legislation. So Maryland has a 3% cap on WMATA, DC does not. Maryland has similar exclusions to the cap, but they don't have Delegate Watts' newest exclusion. And so we'll just see how that sort of plays together, and we'll put that in the report for next time.
Okay, sounds good. Appreciate it, Zach. All right, now without any further ado, agenda item number 5. Any other items of jurisdictional importance? All right, going once, going twice. No takers. So before we adjourn, I'd just like to mention one thing. I wanted to remind everyone that WMATA General Manager Paul Whitterfield will be coming to speak before the commission at the October meeting. As you all know, he was originally supposed to speak at the September meeting, but unfortunately had to cancel to deal with the budget, which we have thoroughly discussed tonight. So we all realize and understand the situation. So last call, anything for the good of the order? All right. Well, thank you all so much. And this meeting is now adjourned. Have a good night, everybody.
Have a good night, everyone.